Welcome everyone to the latest edition of the Urban Equity Chats vidcast. My name is Andre Darmanin, and I'm the host of these chats. And today's topic will be on talking about performative measures and moving those to action. So, who I have here on this podcast is Farrell Hall, Christopher Scipio, and Saleha Khan. So basically what we're going to be doing in this topic is in this session is to talk about how do we move from the performative measures that we've talked about to action. We see it in our equity as equity practitioners. We see this in our work all the time, but nothing is ever done, or very little has been done to this point. So how do we move from that? And so our panelists will have this discussion on this topic and tell their stories about what they've experienced and how do we move forward from that. So, and then of course at the end of this, close to the end of this, within probably the last 10 minutes, 5 minutes of the session, I'd like to open up to questions, or even after that, you can open up to questions when it comes to this stuff. So before anything, let me just have everyone introduce themselves first, instead of me doing that myself and going on their spiel. So let's start in order for my screen. So let's start with Farrell. Go right ahead. Tell us about yourself and what makes equity work something that you enjoy.
Thanks, Andre. So I'm Farrell Hall, and currently I am the Chief Inclusion Officer at 9 Story Media Group. I'm located here in Toronto, and I have been with them since September. But before that, for the 5 years before that, I was in the Ontario public sector doing similar work. And equity is everything to me. It is my North Star. I relate to it from my personal identities, and it's been my privilege, sometimes burden, to move this agenda forward within my organizations. Empowering people has always been very, very important to me. So I take what I know and what I have the ability to do to support people, support identity groups, and give them stance in our organization. So it's everything.
Okay, Christopher, go right ahead.
Thank you, Andre, and hello to everyone. So I'm Christopher Scipio, Senior Gender-Based Analysis Plus Policy Advisor for the federal government. This work for me, I would say, is important because people matter. We serve people in the public service, both internally, the people we work with, and the public who we provide services to. And the only way to provide effective, meaningful services that work for people is to understand their identity needs. Unfortunately, we live in a society where, due to colonialism, racism, and other systemic issues, there are power imbalances. So therefore, not everybody can enjoy the same benefits the same way. Some people experience more harms than other people because of identity factors. So my work is to really identify how different groups are impacted, see how we can use data and different responses to reduce some of those barriers. Because at the end of the day, when we design for the margins, when we design for the extremes, and we try to remove barriers for everyone, everybody else will benefit as well. So thank you.
And Saleha?
So at my end, I've been a public servant for 30 years and going. Let's see, I went from education into more professional development and training. And interestingly enough, for the last 20 years, a little bit more, I've been very actively involved and engaged in training specifically for law enforcement. So it has been an absolute pleasure and challenge, and something that keeps me awake at night, but it's something that I absolutely adore. And that something is, how do we ensure that members, workers, staff who are within the organization, within the policing environment, whether civilian, whether of course in uniform or sworn officers, how is everybody really feeling that they're valued at the end of the day? We do a lot of conversations about, and it's we as in a collective, across all the sectors, the conversations around the importance of diversity. It all kind of started back in the 80s from business case and kind of moved forward into the 90s and the 2000s. And then we started talking about, is the right thing to do. And then from the right thing to do, it's just like, okay, is it inclusion? So there's just been this change in the language constantly over the last 20 years plus. Some change has moved a little bit quickly. Some change has happened because of occurrences and happenings and things in historically significant times that have been there. So all of us collectively have really been engaged in the issue of language more than anything else. And I find that to be, like, even for us today, as we start talking about performative to action, 3 years ago, the word performative wasn't exactly too hugely on the radar of a lot of us who are working in this field or in this sector, and I will never call it an industry because it is not. But definitely in terms of the mindset of people, we used to, I have called it checking the boxes, and I think a lot of us understood what checking the box meant, because the idea was that we're only trying to kind of mollify the groups around us in a way that we can say, oh yeah, it's a little pat on the head or a pat on the shoulder. Oh yeah, no, we see you, and of course we value you, and of course we recognize you for who you are, and of course that's why you were hired on. But you really got to fit in with the larger organization as well, right? So those conversations, interestingly enough, haven't changed. That mindset, in all honesty, has not changed. I mean, even if we talk about being performative, I think we actually need to start defining what performative really truly is in the first place. So that would be perhaps the first thing I would want to bring into this conversation.
Well, great. Thanks, Saleha. And thanks everyone for introducing themselves. So I know usually I go in to start the conversation with a land acknowledgement, but you know what? I wanted to get the introductions in because then it would go into the flow of this conversation. So what I'll do first is I'll give the land acknowledgement of where I am as a visitor of this country. So where I stand here at the City of Hamilton, it's situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee and Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit and First Nation. So with that, now this is a perfect example of the land acknowledgement, and what I'm doing, technically speaking, is and what other people have done with this land acknowledgement is this is technically performative, right? Unless I do something with action, and and one of the things, and I put this on my Twitter just yesterday. Someone forwarded me an article it's called "Rethinking the Practice and Performance of Indigenous Land Acknowledgement," and there was and reading this, it's basically a bunch of a bunch of stories being told about their experiences going through it, and one person who was actually the very first speaker in this little panel that was part of this, that was transcripted from this, and I just want to read this briefly. Just so that people will understand where we're coming from with this. So from a person named Dylan Robinson. I like to acknowledge that we are on stolen land. I like to acknowledge that we are on borrowed land. I like to acknowledge that we are on overdue land. I like to acknowledge that we are on pickpocketed land. I like to acknowledge academic colonialism. I like to acknowledge activist colonialism. I like to acknowledge that we are on bureaucratic land. I like to acknowledge poetic colonialism. I like to acknowledge drinking a glass of water 10 minutes ago, not having to boil the water first. I'd like to acknowledge the ice on the inside of the walls when I lived in Labrador in the 1970s as part of the military occupation of Inuit Indian land. I'd like to acknowledge not having mold in my son's room. So he moves from the acknowledgement to what we're seeing as performative. That's a perfect example of what we're seeing. So, in the work that we do as equity practitioners, and I'm going to open up to the floor to the three of you. How are you, what have you seen? What are your stories that have been told? And, and tell us, what has that felt like to you, as whether you're doing the work on a gender equity basis, whether you're doing the work on an anti-Black racism, et cetera. So whoever wants to start, go right ahead.
So I love how Saleha, sorry, were you speaking?
I was saying I'm going to jump in, but go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Farrell.
All right, okay. I love how you mentioned it's really important to define what performative is, but I'll just pause for a moment and go back to this topic. So just think about what really performative is. What is it? We have to think about that. But when it comes to Indigenous land acknowledgements, and I've been in this work for a while, and I saw us start doing them, and personally just had a level of discomfort, because very, very quickly, it seemed like a throwaway item. Hey, we're going to have a meeting. It starts at 9 o'clock. Can you do the land acknowledgement? Good. It's done now into the agenda, right? So then it was just like this thing we did for 30 seconds, then we move on, and we never talk about it. So I had a problem with that. But then I really had the privilege of being invited to the territory that is the Mississaugas of the Credit, and spent a day with them. Because for me in this work, instead of me speaking for other people and saying, this is how they must feel and this is what I think they want, I wanted to hear from them. And within any identity group, there are many voices and many opinions, but for them. So I heard from them, and this is what I think I learned. As someone who grew up and had his K-12 education all in Canada, that entire time, I did not learn about what this land had done to the Indigenous people that were here. Got into my adult work years, didn't have a clue. Much later on, we started cluing in, yet that history existed. So for me, and what I heard from my friends at the Mississaugas of the Credit is, this should be a conversation starter. What I like to do is when someone is asked to say the land acknowledgement, a practice I've had is, I'll say to that person, and can you take some time and think about what it means to you, even if it's admitting like me that you spent all your education in Canada, you didn't have a clue, you live in the middle of one of our big cities, you don't even notice that Indigenous people are there. Say that, and say what you are doing to learn. Because that's what my friends with the Mississaugas of the Credit asked us to do. Take time to learn. Look at those 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Take a piece, learn, talk to community, go to a friendship center, understand what we've done to these people, because that story is enormous. We could take up 4 of these sessions just talking about the history of Indigenous people. So for me, it should be an entry point, and every time we have one, having an acknowledgement, someone should personalize it and say what they've learned and say what they're committed to do. So that's some of my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Chris, I'm going to, just because if I didn't say it, I will forget what the hell I was going to say. So right off the bat, for me, I would acknowledge that I'm actually a settler on this land in Ontario, and that I am at the moment I am in the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, because this is where I'm situated physically. And it's always been a bit of an interesting piece, because at any given time, any one of us, and especially now in this virtual world, we are having conversations from so many different areas and different geographic locations all at one time. And I've had somebody ask me, isn't there one just kind of a universal land acknowledgement? And I said, no. Like, you cannot even take 2 minutes out of your time to figure out where exactly you are and then actually talk about that. So I think that's where checking the box being and actually considering why we do what we do, why we say what we say. I think that for me is perhaps a definition of performative, or an example of the definition of performative. I'm going to read this off, whether it matters to me or not. So at my end, one of the things I've continuously done as a practitioner is, when I, first of all, and I was very uncomfortable reading those land acknowledgements in the very beginning, because I felt that I was being fake. And then I had discussions with elders, people in different communities that have mentored me over time. And I had this honest conversation with them to say, I don't feel qualified to even say something like this, because I don't even know what it is that I can do. And so just like Farrell had said, that's exactly what was said to me was, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? And that's where the whole idea of, rather than checking the box, actually taking into action then comes up. And it's really important then to start building those blocks for yourself. And it was uncomfortable when I said it the first time. And it's equally uncomfortable when I say it the umpteenth time. It is that discomfort that I have to learn to lean into, but I also have to challenge myself to continue to grow in that knowledge. And yes, it's just not going to be go attend, powwow in London when that happens because I'm part of the London community, or go be somewhere and just attend I don't know, a virtual session because someone is doing that. It's way beyond that. It's how do I actually deal with the systemic racism, the systemic anti-indigeneity that exists within our own colonization processes and systems that are in place. It's a lot to process, and I think we really need to be mindful, and not just mindful, but look for actions to do something like that.
Definitely. So for me, I'm in Ottawa, which is a traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And as a public servant within the TRC calls to actions, there's a specific call to public servants to educate themselves, to better understand settler colonialism, to see how that has informed public policy. So I think, to echo Saleha, to echo Andre, it's what do you do now after you make the acknowledgement? And each of us has agency and has power in our own little way in the places where we have influence to take action. So for myself as a public servant, the way that I am able to take action after I acknowledge the traditional lands that I'm on, after I acknowledge the impact of settler colonialism, is when I'm giving policy advice, is to make sure that I'm aware of the falsehoods we've learned about Indigenous people. It makes sure that I'm aware of how settler colonialism feeds into public policy and the harms it creates. And it's also about celebrating Indigenous joy. It's about changing the narrative. It's about finding ways that when someone says, Christopher, can you give me advice on this issue? And I say, here are 3 articles to read. I also include an article written by an Indigenous academic, because we have to decenter exclusionary messages. We have to to decenter colonialism. And I think that's the way we do it. So I think, but that's not enough, right? There is so much more we need to do. Like, I'll be honest, I am not fully aware of all the treaties and all the agreements that cover Ottawa, the Greater Ottawa area. So I'm always learning. And this work is a constant learning and unlearning. And then the last thing I would say on this, why this to me is more than just a statement, is that Black liberation and Indigenous decolonization go hand in hand, right? I cannot in any way imagine that I'm going to fight against anti-Black racism and I'd also fight against anti-Indigenism, right? And indigeneity, those things go hand in hand. So again, to make it non-performative, it does require deep reflection. It requires you to acknowledge your privilege. To Andre's point, sometimes we're not aware. So I mean, I'm born in Toronto, but I went to school in Grenada. And luckily, growing up in the Caribbean, you do learn about Indigenous cultures, like within, like the Caribs, the Arawaks, the Incas, the Aztecs. You come back to Canada, you don't learn that, right? And many people who aren't aware are like, all the stereotypes, all about, addiction issues. Oh, so many people don't know that residential schools only closed like 20 years ago. I mean, so there's a whole lot of unlearning that needs to happen. 1996, right? So there's a whole lot of unlearning that needs to happen, and we have to be intentional. We have to sit with that discomfort, because the people who are excluded have always been uncomfortable. So our temporary discomfort, like, it's a privilege to be like, oh, I feel uncomfortable, I can't handle this conversation. No, like, you have to sit with it, deal with it, and take action. Thanks.
No, and I agree with everything. I echo everything that everyone has said. Tying into that point, I didn't learn anything about residential schools until I lived in Edmonton, and I took a course in this, and I was just like, I didn't learn this in school. Like, as Canadians, as as we are here, we didn't learn about this stuff. And I'm sure there's some, and of course in the US, the Tulsa massacre, I just only heard about this recently. And of course, some Americans have only just heard of this. And it was just like, what are we doing to fight anti-Black racism? And to your point, Christopher, as well, everyone was doing the perfect performative measure and performative actions that took place was after George Floyd, right? We start to see, oh yes, we need to address this. We'll have programs, we'll put in money for this, but we're still in the same state, right? We're still in the same state of how we're of racism and violence against transgender Black youth or transgender Black people. We're starting to see it. And even, there's a whole slew of cases that we're seeing as equity practitioners that we're sitting back and we want to do the work, but we're not able to. And for that as well, one of the things, Christopher, that you had mentioned in our discussion was about, the middle child, right? And so if you want to, expand on that comment that you made about, this work being the middle child of the work that we do, go right ahead. I mean, because that's something that's important to this discussion, especially when there's this hypocrisy that we're doing as practitioners and as people trying to teach this.
And it's like, when you say middle child, what exactly are you referring to? I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Oh no, you were saying something about the middle child with with equity.
It's ignored.
Yeah, I think we were talking about, DEI and
Yeah.
so
right.
everybody understands
Yeah,
diversity
that's right.
and inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and
skip
inclusion,
over
right?
equity.
Yeah.
That's so true. Definitely skip over equity, and I think when it comes to doing equity work, many people say they're doing it, but to the point, we have different understandings of it, right? And equity involves taking a look at the historical power imbalances and really trying to change it and being like, okay, you know what? This system wasn't designed for a certain group of people. Even when they're brought in through diversity hiring, they don't have as much influence. They are having issues with workplace culture, not because of a problem with them, but because of the fact that the system wasn't designed for them, right? So the inclusion efforts still aren't as productive. But beyond that, though, I think, and this goes back to language, right, and knowledge. So the work that I do, and the team that I work with, when we're advising on gender-based analysis plus, we don't stop at gender. Like, we are intentionally aware that body size, age, race, sex, those things matter when using equipment. Those things matter when exposed to chemicals. So we are definitely looking at all those things. All of those things are significant, right? And I think at the core, the school of feminism that you aspire to is very important. So if you aspire to Black liberation feminism, then you know from bell hooks that you must see race, class, and gender as interlocking systems of oppression, right? You realize that if you read Audre Lorde, that there are no single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. So you cannot have a conversation about equity and only look at gender without looking at the other factors. So it's a case in point. Religion, gender, race, class intersect when a young East African Muslim woman wearing a hijab is taking public transit and she hears hateful statements, victimizing her body for her body shape, victimizing who she is because she's a woman and because of her race and her religion. She's further affected because in certain parts of this country, we have exclusionary laws that says she cannot teach and do her work, right? When we're doing this work, we have to think about abilities and addressing ableism, right? In our school systems, we have students, even in our workplace, with mental health issues, with neurological diversity. And why is it that if a Black or Indigenous or racialized student has behavioral issues that are probably because they're experiencing autism spectrum disorder, they are not treated the same when their white student, fellow student has the same behavioral issues, right? So that's an issue, not just of how do we accommodate for abilities and how do we respond to that, but that's also an issue of race, classism, and all those things. So I just really think, if you're doing this work properly, you have to be aware of everything. Of course, there will be situations where certain identity factors are more prevalent, more significant, but there's no real equity if one part of a group is celebrating, but the other people in the group aren't celebrating too.
Good
So
point.
correct,
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Saleha.
That's so, like, that speaks to me on a personal level as well, and so many levels. But I mean, here's the kind of the interesting piece is we end up, in my mind, unfortunately, the diversity supporting side of the DEI work has focused on somehow creating, and I will use the term performative measures, to create this sense of inclusion, which at times is absolutely false and determinant and actually detrimental, because what ends up happening is that on the face of it, on terms of the organizational reputation or the work that's being put out, forward facing, public facing, community facing, we might be very happy to see it and we say, oh yeah, rah, this is what's happening. This particular organization, this particular bank, this particular school, this particular, whatever it is, they're doing such good work. But then when you talk to the people who are working there, that's not their lived experience. Those are not those narratives. That's not their story. And you walk away feeling even more confused at the end of it. Because in my mind, it always comes up to that. Is it really truly happening? Or is it something because it looks so good on the paper? And I know what looks good on the paper. Trust me, I've written reports nonstop for government and for funders and everything. I know what makes it look good on the paper. Yeah. And I also know that the reality could be something quite different, because the experience and the lived reality is going to be different from what the words look like. And I know that within Ontario, we are blessed and privileged to have the Ontario Human Rights Code. And so equity work, I find, actually ends up being a little bit easier for me to kind of, bring into the conversation to say, hey, this is something that matters, because there is a legislative or quasi-legislative authority that gives us that opportunity to work on it. And usually the question that comes up at that time is, what's the bare minimum we can walk away with?
Right.
Or what does it cost?
Again,
or the cost, right?
Yeah. Could I?
How do we check the box?
Go, Farrell, go ahead.
Can I jump in and say, Christopher, thank you for pointing out intersectionality and how important that is and how it impacts people. We need to understand that, because we don't. We're not only offended by one thing based on our identity. And Saleha to talk about those performative measures where, organizations feel that because they can do a little number count and say, well, we have these aspects of diversity, we're good. And so, a real example, but, somewhere in my past, I heard a senior leader say something that sounded exactly like, actually, if we just increase the number of women in leadership positions, everything else will take care of itself. As my face dropped, I was like, what? And where did you learn that? It was like, yes, Farrell, just increase the number of female leaders and we'll take, and obviously I had to just kind of walk away from that. So equity, though, that misunderstood, often ignored middle child is, if I take that extension that Saleha is sort of talking about, when we recruit people who haven't been in our organizations before, and then we pat ourselves on the back to say, look, they're here. But as you're saying, when you talk to them, say, how's it going? It's like, I'm miserable. I'm here. Sometimes I'm the only one, or there's 3 of us, and we get talked over, we're ignored, we bring suggestions, we bring different thinking. No one's paying attention. They're miserable. So equity is that work which creates some discomfort, where we say, and now we're going to create a unique program that supports that group and that group only, because they have been faced with barriers historically. They're way behind the rest of us, and so we need to help them catch up. And it's a program or intervention focused on supporting that group. And that's what equity looks like. They need something else because they face systemic barriers that creates all kinds of outcry and discomfort, but that's what equity is, and that's why it's so meaningful to me.
And you know what's funny?
If I could just add
as you were
one
talking,
thing, Andre.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
To Farrell's point, right? And it's also knowing that, like, when we're doing this equity work, that we're not just saying this group has had negative experiences due to a lack on their part. People who are equity deserving, who have been racialized, marginalized, like, an action has been done to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in addition, when we're creating these programs that are, like Farrell mentioned, that address, respond to unique experiences, we also have to be decentering white supremacy and exclusion and say the reason why you need to get this additional training is because the system and how we've assessed performance is incorrect. So actually, maybe you do not need additional training. What we need is to examine how we evaluate leadership, the competencies that we expect, like this notion of right fit, of organizational culture. Like we're trying to get people to, we say bring your full self to work, but your full self isn't welcomed, right? So you're always going to be, as Saleha and Farrell are saying, uncomfortable because it's a toxic workplace. And until we intentionally remove some of those toxic behaviors, there's always going to be more work to be done. Which is why you can have great initiatives and people still aren't happy because, oh yeah, that person who called me whatever name is not being held to account, but now I got to do this extra work, right? So it's that disconnect that's still problematic.
And it's interesting because I know we're hearing the term equity as being the middle child. I would actually kind of one up that and say it's more like a stepchild that's being dealt with. Because there's a lot of unwelcome, as a noun and an action that gets thrown in your face and that gets laid out in your path. And one of the quickest things, like even like the question that you Farrell, when you were talking about, bring women into leadership and all that's going to take care of herself. What agency are we giving those women? Exactly. How much power are we, the real power, not the power that we say because it's the title, because my title is manager, so it makes me in that position. No, it doesn't. Correct. It doesn't. Correct. Not at all. Right? So it just comes down to how much actual power, how many resources, what supports have actually been laid out. So the work that I'm going to put out actually, and then it's not just the work that gets laid out. If I am to put something as a recommendation, is that recommendation even being considered?
Absolutely.
Because all of us can put together reports after reports and recommendation lists after, we've got the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Federal Commission. What work has exactly been done? And now we're coming up to 10 years and more of that.
Yes.
It's just for them, it's just throwing money and saying the problem's solved. We're done, right? That's what it is with the government is just doing the exact same thing as what corporations do. And I, to your point earlier, Saleha, about, there was just recently, I think it was just yesterday, the day before, Scotiabank had just announced that they have this program. It was all advertised about how they're doing allyship. And I'm like, that's performative. That's performative in itself. Like, why do you need to make a public statement to say that you're doing this? No, what are you doing internally? How is that going to, what kind of action is going to be there? So, and then of course, I'm still on the fence of this whole thing with, for our American audience too, about Joe Biden saying that, well, the story is that he's going to be announcing a Black woman as a Supreme Court nominee. Now, is that performative because of the fact it's a Black History Month, or symbolic, right? And that's the thing I'm kind of wrapping my head around with that. And of course, too, and one more thing, I just want to also add, there was a question in the audience about, are there lessons in the past attempts to suppress the Holocaust with recent attempts in the US and suppressing knowledge of Holocaust and racism? So, that ties into everything as well. So anyone want to jump in on that?
So thank you so much for making that statement. And I'm sorry if I'm hogging the time, because I really want to get that answer, or at least put that discussion out there. There has to be a difference between what we see as truly being performative, or what we understand and recognize as being truly performative, and as what I know you Andre, you use the word symbolic, but for me, it's more in terms of affirming the need for the community, or affirming the community itself. So my position, as whether as a specialist, whether as a manager, whatever, that is performative at the end of the day. Every one of us, Chris and Farrell both as well, both of our positions are performative, because we were brought in so that we could be trotted out, or we could be talked about. And I'm not talking about my current job or the previous or the one before that, but I know perfectly well, there's always that time when that picture gets taken around and say, hey, we have a person who does this work for us. You know, that in itself is absolutely performative. However, and I am using the word however here, we also know that this was something that the community wanted. This is something that the community and racialized and minoritized folks have always wanted to see, that representation. We talk about representation, right? So is flying a Black History Month flag performative? Is having the establishing or launching a Black ISN because it is the it's the Black History Month, or identifying or nominating a Black woman nominee for Supreme Court, is that performative? Is that truly performative? Or is it these are the actions that we as community feel encouraged about, actually want to see more of that happen? Because it is putting a message out to the white supremacy as well. It is putting a message out to the larger community to say, hey, guess what? This kind of privilege, this kind of positional privilege is also being dedicated. This time and effort and money and resources and people are also being dedicated to do this work. I'm happy that Scotiabank is doing allyship work. Hell, I'm going to try and find out what it's doing and see if I can bring in more people and connect those from the different communities that actually will benefit from those dollar figures. To me, that's not being performative at all. To me, that's being strategic. And unfortunately, for people like us, all four of us in this field, in this area, in the passions that we carry for ourselves, a lot of times you say that, well, at least the door is open, my foot's in the door. Maybe the rest of me will follow.
And I'd add to that, my thoughts on that are, there are actions we take that I totally understand need to be communicated. Somebody needs to know we were launching a program or opening a door, etc. But then sometimes I actually say this internally, and now just shut up, stop talking, and do the work. So that means there's this extra burden for people like me and my panelists to really get down into the weeds and create action, create change. Because for me, the best PR, the best communication strategy is not when I get my team to publish something on social media or in a newspaper. The best PR and communication and feedback is when my stakeholders, whether that's students, children, the general public, the employees, prospective employees, say, since you've been here and started putting these programs into place, I feel a change. This has shifted for me. I'm now in the door. I'm now at the table. I'm now having a different experience. That's really what I want to hear. And somewhere along the line, of course, our organizations want to, market that champion that say, hey, we hired one of us and this is what they did and we're good. Well, we're never going to be done this work. But it's a balance, and I really focus on sometimes just staying a little bit more quiet and going and doing the work that needs to be done and letting people feel that experience. Like, yes, my life is different because my organization has started this work.
Definitely. And I think, representation matters, but that is not the end goal, right? I think it's far overdue for the United States to have a Black woman on the Supreme Court. The same way it's far overdue that Canada finally has a racialized justice on our Supreme Court, right? It's taken so long because his lived experiences matter when interpreting the law. But we can't be having the lonely only, right? We gotta get past the you are the first. Like, I mean, how many times are we gonna be the first, right? Also, why do we always have to be exceptional? Like, whoever they think of, should they appoint a Black woman as a judge, is going to have to graduate from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, president of this, ran like 200 cases. Like, this idea of Black exceptionalism, racialized exceptionalism, indigenous exceptionalism, whereas white folk, because the system has been designed for them, can be mediocre. Like, it would be nice if some days we don't always have to be on 110%, and let's be like 95%. You know, that would be nice a little bit, right? But I definitely think to the point with Scotiabank, or even in the public sector, right, whichever level of government, yes, people want to boast, they want to celebrate, but it's what you do afterwards. So if you do launch an initiative like Scotiabank does on allyship, well, when they talk about allyship, do they say it's a noun or a verb? And where are they spending that money, right? So there was a study I read about recently that said like about $9 billion has been spent in DEI in the last year and a half. And people are looking at artificial intelligence to help them solve that. But we all know that artificial intelligence is full of bias and creates tons of harm. And giving money to the people who created the problem, that's where the performative actions happen, right? And that's the problem, because they're just doing it for the fame. But if they hire people like Joy Bulami to run their program, or Dr. Timit Gabbett, you know, and other people like Deb Raj and so on, people who are doing artificial intelligence in a deeper way and understanding biases, then it's a good thing, right? Because we have to seize the opportunities when they do come to us. Unfortunately, the time we have to do this work shouldn't be limited, but it is limited in the amount of attention that we have right now. So when performative actions happen, it's on us to say, we're going to take it a step further. We're going to hold you to account. We're going to make sure that oh, and then one more thing, it has to be validated by the people impacted, right? So as long as an organization is like, oh, we have this great initiative for our new employees, make them feel good, and 100 people came to the session from that Farrell taught, but that's great. But people are like, yeah, and what? Nothing's changed. Then that initiative wasn't enough, right? Now you need to bring in Saleha to come and do some more work so that they feel a little bit better, right? So until things are validated by the people who've been excluded, then it's going to remain performative. Yeah.
No, and I agree with you on all of that. I mean, it's just, and this is why these are things that just go in my head. I mean, I know you three are more immersed in it than I am. I'm still learning. I mean, we're all still learning no matter what, each and every day in our work, we are still learning. And it's these statements that happen and that are continues to happen. And, Christopher, like you said, that whole, being the first person of this, being the first person of that, but when is that going to stop? Right. And that's something. So then I guess to round out this discussion, as we start to close off and want to take some questions from the audience here, it's like, we've already kind of alluded to the action part, but, not only what are you doing to create that action, but what needs to be done on top of what's been said or what hasn't been said about action. So whoever wants to talk about it, I mean, I know that we need to talk about, whether it's, within a strategic plan, we need to talk about what are the metrics for that, right? That's something that needs to be, that's the hard and fast concrete that ties to business planning. That's something that needs to be done. In terms of, we talk about diversity hires, that's something that's there. And, we talk about that, but also it's not just for diversity hires. It's how many people are in leadership positions, how many people are promoted to those positions, right? That's the action that we need within those areas. So how do we move forward with that? So, I'll anyone else want to chime in on that?
So I'd say a measure for me, and around equity. So equity for me also compels me to look at things and do them differently. Right? So I shouldn't be in this work and just carrying on what the organization has done for the last 5 years. We have to look at what our data is telling us, what our people are telling us, and do things in a different way. But to move away from being performative, what that also says to me is I should not be the only one in my organization doing things differently. While I'm going to educate and teach my fellow colleagues, they need to do some of their own work, get lit on fire, and also look at their own portfolios through an anti-oppressive lens and say, oh my God, I've been here for 10 years doing it this way. I now know I need to do it differently because I want to include these groups and listen to them and respond to them differently than I had before. And not be just motivated by the bottom line, but that combination. You know what? If I actually have more diverse thinking around the table, we actually create a better product and it does impact your bottom line. But you have to think about doing things differently.
Anyone else? While I open the floor here after when to talk,
I was thinking about what you said, Andre, in terms of who gets situated in places, you know, how many leaders have been assigned and who has been assigned to that leadership position. I think that who is a very important question, or a very kind of a particular aspect, because again, those who are deciding to give power in the hands of another person are more than likely going to choose someone with a similar mindset. So it doesn't matter that the person may look brown, may look like a woman, may have a name like mine, but if they do not have the actual understanding around equity and the lived experience around it as well, then there will be greater challenges, because we all know that we come across gatekeepers at any given time. And the challenge that then ends up happening is, again, it's part of that right fit within the organization, right? So you get more gatekeepers being assigned in certain positions of privilege and power, and all it does is it frustrates everybody else around them. And people also say, but look, your equity person, your manager, your human rights person actually said the same thing. You know, they're saying we don't need to make that change because it just doesn't matter. And so we, again, have to continue to find some measure of accountability. And I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't. And so for me, that would be something that I would probably look at the network here and look at the people to say, what has been your experience? What is it that you've done? Because otherwise, we keep going back to that. It's cyclical. It's constantly cyclical. And we keep doing the same thing over and over again. The equity work, it is so frustrating and challenging and heartbreaking at times and disappointing at times. And I'm being very honest when I'm being very vulnerable when I say that, because we find ourselves having those similar conversations, and you say, okay, but didn't I just say the same thing 10 years ago? Why are we still here?
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely it. You know, it takes a toll on your mental well-being, because like you're reliving these traumas over and over, and it's a heavy thing. You know, I would say right now I'm reading this book called The Conversation by Dr. Robert Livingston, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it. And he talks about like the PRESS model: problem awareness, root cause analysis, empathy, strategy, and sacrifice, as a way for doing this equity work. And I think what he says is, you know, to get people truly motivated, engaged, and devoted to a course of action, they have to develop a much greater understanding, appreciation, and responsibility for the work to be taken. So it's going to require some difficult conversations, like, do I know what the problem is? Do I want to know what the problem is? Do I care about the people impacted? What do I know about them? And do I care enough to make that change, right? If I've benefited from the status quo and moved up, and I have these benefits, do I want to give it up? But we have to shift the thinking, though, because like the pie isn't a zero-sum game. Like there's enough pie for us to have equitable slices, right? And we need to like shift our thinking so that we can move forward. So I just wanted to end with that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll open up to the floor. Anyone who wants to add to this discussion or have any comments, just unmute yourself, and more than welcome to add to the conversation.
I'll just throw in one little quote that I've adapted that I've heard,
Yeah.
and probably all three of you have heard it too. The quote is from Unknown, that for those who are used to privilege, equity feels like oppression. And I swapped out, the word used to be equality, and I swapped out equality for equity. But for those who are used to privilege, equity feels like oppression.
Yeah, and that's, and as we talked about, the middle child of equity, right? I mean, we have to also move towards belonging, and that's something that we need to have this discussion on, because we don't, we talk about EDI, DEI, but there's still no belonging in this discussion. So, where do we go with that as well? And that's another thing that we can go forever on that conversation. Anyone else want to add anything? And anyone else from the audience want to add anything at all? I'm sure Saleha, I know Saleha is just biting her. I can see she wants to say something. No.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Janelle, fantastic conversation. I'm very intrigued over here. I just have a question for members of the racialized community who are perhaps in privileged positions. What would you say are some blind spots that perhaps we should be more aware of when we're also contributing to the fight for equity and inclusion, while we're also simultaneously fighting and making a movement when it comes to fighting the systemic oppression as well? What are some blind spots perhaps that we should also be considerate of?
That is exactly where this requires me to really be very, very introspective. I need to know what my blind spots are, which means I need to constantly educate myself. And this is not just an education where I read an article, but this is about so much that we have to do and unfortunately it is extra work at my end, and it is on my own time, and it is with my own well-being in stake. But I need to do that, because otherwise I will turn into all those doorkeepers that I have fought my entire life. And so absolutely, the question you're asking about and the question you're talking about is, what are those blind spots? Yes, I can have blind spots around gender, and I will have blind spots against, and actually against other groups of people that I do not identify with, right? I may have blind spots around gender expression or gender identity, but those are the questions that I think we need to have. And one way that I have found that has helped me is having those extremely honest conversations with other people around me, from other practitioners, from members of my network, someone like Andre, someone like Chris, someone like Farrell, to say, hey, can you tell me, when I said this, what did it sound like? Right? Because that is really going to be important. That's when these folks will be able to tell me, hey, when you say these folks, or when you say them, or when you say that, or when you say person, wow, that just makes me feel like, who the hell am I? Right? So it's really important to bring that up. Compassion. And it's compassion not just for myself, but compassion for the other person. And honestly, humility is really, really, really significant. I have never, and I will never want to be identified as an expert in my field. There is impossible for a person to be expert, to be an expert on humanity, because that's what this work is about. Equity work is about human beings. In my own family, I have 4 children. They're like north, east, west, south. They're the news. I'm a single parent. I'm a single mom, raised them all exactly the same way. But guess what? Right now where they are, every single one of them goes in exactly the opposite direction. So, and this is just in my household. So recognizing that, I need to understand that everybody's experience is also going to be different. And yes, we have to be open to learning. And part of learning is hearing what others are thinking about us.
Perfect. Well said.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. I mean, we all, I've gone through that too, especially for me. One of the things, because of the fact I'm a mixed race person, but I also say to myself, I haven't experienced everything that a Black person has experienced, right? but I understand. I've learned. I've seen it happen. But but at the same time, there's probably parts of us, and even in our work that we do, that we've contributed in the past. We've contributed to the anti-Black racism that exists, that we contribute to the, to against Indigenous people and whatnot, because of the fact that we didn't learn, the systems didn't allow us to learn it. We've been blinded by that. And we do have those blind spots in itself. So that's something that I can say that I can admit, and I still have a lot to learn. And if anyone says that they are an expert in this, they're only fooling themselves. Christopher, you want to say something?
Yeah, no one's an expert, and it's also realizing that racialized people can reproduce white supremacy because we are educated within that space. We are operating in that space. So we constantly need to be questioning ourselves, reflecting to that point of talking to people who do this work from different perspectives, and constantly unlearning. Like, that is a constant thing. It's also realizing that I do have privilege. Like, I am a senior policy advisor. I have a master's degree. I'm a parent. I live in Canada. I'm a Black man. And at different times, I have a ton of privilege. And other times, like it's winter, right? If I go to the mall on a Saturday, but I'm not wearing a suit, and I got on my sweater or my winter coat, I'm followed around by security. I've lost my privilege to an extent there. During the weekday in my suits, how can I help you, sir? What do you need, right? So it's knowing that people don't all have the same experiences that we have. But just because I haven't experienced it doesn't mean it's not true. So I don't need to experience Farrell's reality or Sarah's reality or Deepika's reality or Janelle's reality to know that it's real, right? And also knowing that my role with the privilege that I have is to make more space for other people, right? I think there's a Toni Morrison quote, like, when you get these fancy degrees and your fancy jobs, your real job is to bring in more people, to make more change. And that's what we need to do as racialized people. We're constantly doing this work, but we also have to take care of ourselves, because we're trying to fix a system that harms us, but we also get paid by the system, right? So it is a duality that we have to be aware of. Thanks.
Any last words before we close up? I mean, I just want to say too, Dio has also echoed the same statements as what you said, or what we've said on this last little session. So thank you for that, Dio. Anyone else have any last comments before we close this off?
It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Yes, it's been a privilege. Yeah. And you know what? Thank you everyone for being as part of this panel. This was a wonderful discussion. This is something that we needed to have, and hopefully everyone who's on this in the audience is willing to take that next step in terms of the action that we need to move from performative statements that we're seeing to creating that action, to seeing the people within the workplaces, within leadership positions, and setting the example, and so that it becomes normal for us to have, the intersectionality within our workplaces, and not even really talk about it. It's just, this is who we are, who we come as, and we move forward from there. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank thank our panelists, Farrell, Chris, and Saleha for joining us in this conversation. And I just want to close off by saying, Black History Month is just around the corner. Hopefully it's not performative, because as we say, Black history is 365 days of the year. So that's something that's really important, and then you carry on moving forward. So thank you very much for everyone.
How are you?
Thanks so much.
Hello, so much. Take care, everybody.
All right, take care, everyone, and looking forward. And I'll be announcing the next session in the next few days. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.